All right. Hello, hello, hello. This is some people coming into the room. Please come in. It's lovely to see you all. Thanks so much for showing up for this panel on the Saturday afternoon. As far as I can tell, it's the last one on AI at this festival, at least in English. So we have the somewhat unenviable task of trying to say something that you haven't yet heard at one of the other 13 panels on this topic which preceded this one, but we will try. I'm Felix Simon. I'm a communication researcher at the University of Oxford, where I've been researching AI in the news since 2019. And before I ask the other panelists to introduce themselves, let me briefly tell you what we're going to do here. In many ways, this festival has been a testament to the frenzy we currently have around the latest iteration of AI, what has been labeled generative AI because of the functionality of these systems to generate new data from existing data and to carry out a range of tasks that were previously beyond the reach of these systems. And everyone seems to be using them, or at least that's what they pretend they do. And as we've learned at the many other panels on this, the applications on editorial and on the business side are plenty, but so are the concerns and the issues around the use of this technology in news organizations. And we call this panel 1 year on, basically to take stock of recent developments and look at the realized, but especially at the unrealized promises of AI and Gen AI in a news context, sort of since the last festival in 2023, when ChatGPT was still a fairly new thing to many people. And to do this, I have brought with me the combined firepower of 3 experts who've worked on AI long before it was the hot shit, as they say these days. So Nick, Chris, and Agnes, would you please quickly introduce yourselves, starting with Nick.
Hi everyone, I'm Nick Diakopoulos. I'm a professor of communication studies and computer science at Northwestern University, just outside Chicago. I run a lab there called the Computational Journalism Lab. We do a lot of research on AI algorithms and automation in news production and distribution consumption. And I also run a blog called Generative AI Newsroom. If you're curious to check it out, it's a space where folks, researchers, practitioners, blog and share about use cases and different tasks and ethical, legal, and social implications of generative AI in news production and in the news ecosystem. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll go next. My name is Agnes Stenbom. I run a innovation and inclusion unit at Schibsted, the Nordic media group. I also wear 2 additional hats that are relevant to this conversation, one being that I am an industrial PhD candidate at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, where I'm based. And I also co-founded and manage a network called the Nordic AI Journalism Network, which gathers around 450 Nordic professionals working with AI in newsrooms. We just hosted the Nordic AI and Media Summit in Copenhagen last week. You asked us in prepping for this conversation to think about how long we have been working with AI, and I counted and I saw that it was 6 years, almost on the day. And I came into this world largely out of a risk perspective, working with risk management, risk prevention in AI, and then I took a detour to product management and strategy in AI. And I've been doing research on it for 4 years.
Thank you, Agnes. Chris.
Hey, everyone. So I'm Chris Moran, and I'm the head of editorial innovation at The Guardian. I started out at The Guardian as a sub-editor. I was a freelance sub-editor for about 10 years. And then I moved into audience. I created the audience team at The Guardian and co-created the real-time data tool OFAN that powers most of our newsroom insights and helps change culture for the better in our journalism by giving us more of a sense of what the reader wants and how the reader is engaging with our journalism. And in doing that, I started to work more and more with engineers. And so eventually I've become the kind of bridge between editorial and product, thinking about new features and new products that we can build and innovating around journalism. I'm the newsroom lead on generative AI. I've been working with our data science team for about 5 years, but obviously Gen AI is about kind of, what is it now? Is it 16 months now in earnest? That probably the 3 of us have spoken about nothing else since. Yeah, it's lovely to be here.
Amazing, thank you all. And yeah, let's get right into it. I think the first thing I would like to tease out in this panel is your thoughts on how far we have come since the last festival and what the current state of Gen AI integration in the news is. And I asked you all to prepare a bit on this one. So what are some of the most promising use cases for Gen AI news organizations around existing workflows, products, or maybe even new and unforeseen users that you've seen? That could be in your own organization, could be elsewhere, it could be at this festival. Let's maybe start with the academic in the room, with Nick, and then go to Agnes and Chris.
Sure. So last week, we actually published a report that I worked on with the Associated Press. It's called Generative AI and Journalism, and it's based on a survey of about 300 practitioners in industry from around the world, but mostly in North America and Europe. And one of the primary goals of the survey was to just understand like how newsrooms were even using this technology and how they would maybe aspirationally like to use the technology if it were kind of up to the task. And certainly from those responses, I mean, we know that a lot of newsrooms are using it for headlines, for various forms of text production, social media, posting, newsletters, curation, lead generation, quiz generation, but also things like information gathering and sense making. So things like helping you discover news information, brainstorming, doing research, helping with curation, multimedia content production, so image and illustration creation and editing, and then also sort of more businessy uses. So writing emails, generating SEO text, marketing materials, things of that nature. So that's kind of the landscape of where the technology is currently being used amongst the newsrooms that we surveyed. And aspirationally, I would say that people are interested in kind of moving the technology more into information gathering and sense making. So how can you kind of use Gen AI to parse through large data sets or document sets and find interesting things to write about, as well as enhancing things like business use cases. So just like cutting down on like the boring, repetitive kind of office work tasks that maybe can be delegated to the technology.
Maybe just a quick follow-up on this one. Is there any sort of use which has been sort of uniquely been enabled by Gen AI in comparison to traditional forms of AI that you've seen?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that some of the content production use cases around, even things like, headline generation or summarization. I mean, there were versions of that before generative AI based on, more established earlier versions of natural language processing, but I think we sort of saw a step change in the capabilities, and so we see more organizations getting comfortable with that, with those use cases.
Terrific, thank you. Agnes?
Yeah, to not repeat all of the great cases that Nick mentioned, because I think many of those are what is in production in a media group like ours right now. I think what is different this year compared to last is that the AI tooling is now integrated in many of the mainstream media operations. So for us at Schibsted, that means bringing the tools into our CMS, having AI not be something that you work with on the side or in a separate workflow, but something that is an integral part of your day-to-day operations. So for us, a lot of our newsrooms, so we share a CMS at Schibsted and we built our own so we can control the design of it. But we also have additional toolboxes that a lot of our newsrooms have built for themselves. So they build their own journalistic AI toolbox, basically. And within that toolbox, that is, again, integrated in the CMS, you find all of these neat little task doers, from summarization to generating a TikTok script or going through a PDF, turning it into a readable file. Or extracting information from large PDF reports. All of those, sometimes quite tedious tasks now put into one interface that you can easily work with. I think that's a big difference from last year when we were just talking about the tools and the specific interface of ChatGPT.
So basically from aspirational to actual users. Chris?
I think one of the things that characterizes this kind of technology right now is the gap in many different ways. So fundamentally, the gap between what it can do but what it can do reliably, and also how you think it works and how it does work, and various other things. For me, most of the exciting things I would like to do with this technology become possible when you can automate it to the reader. You then hit scale, you hit kind of really exciting use cases. But for us at The Guardian right now, and I think for most news organizations, what's become very clear is you can't do that. You almost certainly have to have a human in the loop. And as soon as you get a human in the loop, most efficiencies, or at least the scale of efficiencies, start to drop right down. So in a funny way, I think, all of the things that we are talking about are really quite conservative. In some ways, this is a conservative technology. It takes stuff that already exists and reshapes it. And so my personal feeling right now is just a slight sense of deflation. I'm incredibly excited by this technology. I really would like to get going with it, but it'd be really nice if we could really rely on it fundamentally.
Well, I mean, at least in this context, deflation is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, the economists probably take a different view on this. But let's maybe also talk about the things that have not worked out. I mean, we always hear about exciting use cases, people using it to do all these wonderful things. But you already touched upon quite another important point of view, and one I've been making in my research, that there is a reality to how technology gets used in practice, and often that's quite disappointing in comparison. So could this panel again give me and the audience some idea of what has not worked out, the things that have abysmally failed, not necessarily just because of the technology, but also the way you tried to make the technology work and it just didn't happen the way you anticipated it. And maybe we start with you again and then sort of go back to this side to Nick.
So at The Guardian, we are slightly behind the position in terms of we have not deployed this into our tooling yet, and that's been quite intentional. We've been intentionally in a period of research and development. So what I'm about to describe, the use case failed, but we felt that it was time well spent to learn about the technology. We decided to try and fine-tune. We wanted our team to get a better sense of what fine-tuning meant, and we also wanted to throw that at something more complex than, say, headlines, right? We wanted to stretch it a little bit. And so what we landed on was the use case of live blog summaries. So every 4 hours or so, one of our live bloggers will end up manually describing what has already happened in the live blog from what they've written in an attempt to help somebody who might have landed in the live blog halfway through, right? So, which can be quite a confusing experience. And obviously, we don't want the live blogger to spend their time rewriting what they have done, right? So we thought, could we fine-tune on our historical corpus of summaries and live blogs and try and get the machine to deliver this? Initially, the idea was to deliver it to the live blogger in the CMS to say, would you press a button and it says, I suggest this is your summary, is this okay? And you can edit it. And then, hey, very excitingly, if that looked really great, what you really want is you want to take the user out of the loop, the human out of the loop actually, and you want the reader to arrive in the live blog at the point they arrive, press the button and it summarizes it for them at that particular point. And we learned so much doing this. We learned a huge amount about evaluation, which we might talk about later, but also about the use case and why this is hard. So if you give an LLM a really well-structured article, there are so many linguistic cues in that article to help the machine understand what is important, right? Repetition, where a fact appears in the text, whether it's also in the headline, and so on. So it's really good at transforming a single piece of well-written journalism. But actually, it's very different if instead you feed that machine a reverse chronological list of events with no signal about the importance of each of those events, right? So what we realized, obviously, is we were asking the machine to try and be a journalist in the context of the day, all of the context they had that day, watching the telly, listening to the radio, following tweets and so on and so forth. What's interesting was that the fine-tuning did make it better at this process. It wasn't perfect, but it did get better at identifying important things, but I have no idea really why. Right? If you think about it, it's probably not because it's begun to understand what is important journalistically. But the other thing that we picked up on was often when our live bloggers were summarizing, they weren't just reproducing what they'd written, they were often adding a little bit more context right, in the summary. So the other thing we found was we were teaching the machine to make some other stuff up, right? Which in the journalist case is fine because they know what they're talking about and they're there. But in the machine's case, it's literally just making it up. So it was a fascinating experiment. It was a really great use of our time, but we didn't end up deploying it for some quite obvious reasons.
Thank you so much for being so honest about this. Agnes, anything that really went wrong at Schibsted?
No, everything's perfectly fine. No, I'm sure there's lots of things going wrong. Most of our implementations are bad in the beginning, but then we iterate, improve, and deploy. But when I think about what has not gone wrong, but maybe where expectations of last year have not yet been met, I think a lot about what type of implementations it is that we're seeing. And what I'm seeing is exploitative innovation. We're using AI tools to do things we were already doing, but in more efficient ways or in new ways. What I think we should be doing is explorative innovation, figure out what the new things that we should be doing are. But instead, we are clinging on to our old habits and trying to make them better. And that's an interesting strategy, given that our entire information ecosystem is changing, but we're trying to perfect the raft that we are on. So that's one concern. Another concern is the direction or the origin of innovation. I feel like we are largely an inside-out world right now. We are looking at how AI can help us within the newsroom do our jobs easier or save us time, rather than looking at our audience, their needs, and how AI can help us solve or meet them. So those are two, we can call them failures, if you'd like, that I think we need to be dealing with as an industry.
Wonderful. Nick, you always got the wonderful high-level view of things. What's your sort of take on what has not worked out?
Yeah, so I mean, I would also add on to what Agnes was saying, in the sense that I think, you know, when generative AI burst onto the scene in November 2022, there were very high expectations for the capabilities of these models in terms of making work more efficient. And you know, we certainly see a lot of news organizations trying to figure out how they're going to find efficiency gains through the use of these technologies in their existing workflows. And that's fine if you want to optimize your workflow and maybe squeeze another 10 or 20% of efficiency and output out of your existing kind of workflow and labor force. But one of the interesting things that came out of the data we collected for the AP that I mentioned before is that there's a lot of uncertainty around whether or not this technology is really yielding the efficiency gains that I think it was hyped to have. So maybe there are some tasks where it really does save a lot of time, and wow, if you use Photoshop's generative AI capabilities, you can edit an image a lot more quickly, or you can create some kind of visual reference material more quickly, or iterate on ideas more quickly. But for some of the other use cases that people described in the survey, it's really unclear. Is it saving time? Or am I spending more time figuring out how to write this prompt to get the thing to do the thing that I actually want it to do? And all the iteration and trying to figure out, is it actually doing what I want? So this idea of like controllability, is it actually, are we able to get it to do the things that we want? So those are some of the issues. And then I would also say, I think there's maybe been some, well, I don't know if it's deflated expectations, but certainly there's always been this concern around the quality of the output from these models. And I think that continues to be a concern that we hear from folks in the survey. I think quality can be defined in many different ways. It could be like the relevance of the headlines that are generated. It could be the bias of the text that's produced, the implicit biases that are maybe reflected in that. And so that maybe connects back a little bit to what Chris was referencing in terms of the need to have a human in the loop still. So, you know, it's the quality is still not at the level where professional journalists would say, yeah, you know what, that's really high quality, Guardian level stuff that we're just going to press a button and it'll get published. It's more like, it's pretty good, but well, let's still have our professional editor check that before we publish it.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. I mean, I think one of the things, though, as well is the technology astounds me at times when you ask it to do something quite difficult, right? It is unbelievably impressive. So for me, it's less necessarily the potential for quality and just more how the next time you press the button, it does something super weird. You know, it's more the instability of it. The other point I wanted to make is, if you are, I don't know, psychotically committed to whittling down your staff at an organization, then efficiency is very easy to define and measure. But I think for most of us, ultimately, in terms of production tooling, you end up not just wanting to be efficient, you also ideally want it to improve quality at the same time, right? We're all talking about these things as co-pilot tools. So judging whether your tooling is doing something around headlines, you might not just want to, I don't know, measure how quickly someone's writing a headline, right? You might want to measure whether or not the general quality of headlines is raised as well. Because ideally, if you're building these tools, I think, or framing them in the right way, you probably are not building a tool which suggests one headline automatically and they should probably take it. You're probably building a tool which might suggest some headlines to help them start being creative rather than, 100% replacing it.
I think this really points to one of the key challenges that the industry is going to have to figure out to really unleash the value from these tools is how do you define quality and define quality for different kinds of content, different kinds of tasks that journalists need to accomplish. We kind of need to get more granular. We can't just say, well, journalism produces high quality content and that Google search engine experience stuff, that's low quality commodity garbage. We need to get more specific and define what we mean by quality and how to measure it. And then maybe we can do some market positioning based on that.
I think in many ways of what this boils down to is something that we already knew thanks to people like Charlie Beckett who's in the room and their research is it's when we talk about AI in any form of AI, it's very task dependent. It really differs what they can do depending on the tasks you throw this technology at. Some of my own work has shown the same for the Tower Center where, yes, take transcription, that's where you can really get efficiency gains. It's quite easy to measure because if you take, 4 hours as a human to transcribe 1 hour of audio and suddenly you have a system which can do the same work in 30 seconds, that's a very easy input-output function, and you can measure the efficiency gain. It's a quite different thing when it comes to even things like editing a story, where usually, as any journalist knows, you have back and forth between you and your editor, and then the editor says, well, I don't like the sentence, so please have another try. I think that's a big problem with all of this technology. It really have to look at the specific use case and then evaluate, which actually brings me to the next point I think we wanted to talk about, is this question of how do you evaluate that stuff? How do you build evaluation routines and sort of kind of workflows to actually make sure that for a given task, the system is doing what it's doing and to what extent it is doing this thing well. So maybe let's start with Agnes and sort of how they have been handling this at Shipstead, and then have Nick and Chris pitch in.
Yeah, so we do this in a lot of different ways, also depending on the use case, because they vary so much. But I would say a combination of automated metrics for quality evaluations, from technical Rouge scores to whatever other smart methods there are right now, for evaluating textual output, for example, to having a human feedback loop, editor in the loop mechanism where we often have.
Can you maybe give us an example?
Yeah, so the tools that we have usually give options rather than saying, this is the AI-generated headline that you should publish. Rather, it's here are 3 or 5 different headlines, and then seeing which one is chosen by the editor or journalist in question is then a feedback loop into the system. So we retrain with the chosen headlines. So that's one example. But I also think, just tapping into the previous conversation about what we mean when we say quality, I think it's very important that we also think about product quality or product experience quality as a metric, not just looking at the text, whether we think it's a great text, but what that text does to a user or for a user. Just one example of how I want to challenge the narrative of not being able to publish anything in an automated way. Because one thing that we have been doing for a long time, and I'm looking at Lena, who's the product manager for this, who's in the room, is that we are automatically publishing AI-generated text-to-speech versions of our stories. So at the push of a button, you can get your article read out loud by a synthetic voice clone. And the quality of that voice has varied. From the start, it wasn't perfect. Right now, it's quite good. It sounds almost exactly like the human journalist behind it, Anne Lindholm. But it's not perfect. But the quality of that implementation is still great because it provides a real service to our users. In this case, the innovation happened through a process where we saw that a lot of kids in our markets they have hearing impairments, and they need the option to listen to the news. They read news in schools, so we wanted to give that service to them. So even if the voice isn't perfect, if you had an automated metric, the score would probably be bad. The product quality is great, so we still deem it a success.
Amazing. Chris, Nick, anything to add?
Yeah. Sometimes you shouldn't bother measuring, right? Transcription, I wouldn't set up any systems to measure that. It's straightforwardly going to be really helpful for everyone. So, we don't always have to do that. Interestingly, it's often the most difficult cases where you do have to measure. Yes, so in terms of the evaluation of fine-tuning is a really interesting thing for me because stupidly, I'm not that clever, frankly, but I had always assumed that, fine-tuning involved basically pressing a button and kind of it being better and you will move along. But what we found in that kind of live blog summarizing thing was we had to think really carefully about not just how you think about it, but also you have to build tools to allow your users to evaluate. So we had to build a system where it showed the original human live blog summary next to the fine-tuned version. And then we had to think about what feedback do we need to collect from the user to judge whether or not this thing is good. So we ended up kind of with something fairly simple. We said, each bullet point you can say, this is accurate, but it's not important enough to appear here. Or you could say, this is made up or inaccurate, or you could say it's accurate, and then we needed a kind of general thing to judge whether or not it was in the style of The Guardian. But just getting to that point, explaining it sounds fairly simple, but it actually takes quite a lot of thinking to get there. And then, of course, what you need to do as a news organization in an ideal world is you need to ask all of your live bloggers to kindly stop live blogging and come and mark the output of this machine across hundreds and hundreds of different examples. And surprisingly enough, I wasn't allowed to ask them to do that because they've got another job to do, right? So it ends up being, me and a bunch of sub-editors. And I did hundreds of these things. It takes at least 10 minutes each because that's quite a kind of kind of tricky area to judge. But I think that's another really important thing is it takes time to fine-tune properly. You really have to think about it, and you could very easily muck it up by not identifying the right things to judge too. So, effort.
So I've been thinking quite a bit about evaluation recently, and kind of mentioned the need to evaluate according to quality dimensions, the need to kind of like break that down and define what we mean by quality. I sort of strongly agree with what Agnes was mentioning before in terms of looking at the product quality, or in my field I would call it user experience, the satisfaction that users have with the experience that they're having with the model or the product overall. So I think we've got to look at those dimensions, and then I think the third dimension that I think about when it comes to evaluation is the degree to which the generative AI aligns with the values that are important, either to the field, like overall big picture principles and values of journalism, or of the organization, or perhaps of an individual journalist, but thinking about like particular news values or news judgments that are important to align with. Thinking about different dimensions of a style book that the model should align with, or different dimensions of bias that are important to take into account to consider, like, is the output from this model really presenting the world in the way that we as an organization think this topic should be presented. And then, some of the things that Chris was mentioning, when you're rating these fine-tuned models, we've got to think about, like, what's important, what's relevant. And so thinking about, like, I think about that as kind of a news value in a sense. That relevance function may also differ based on different whatever news organization you're at. So you've got to really be thinking about, like, measuring this degree of alignment between the values that you have as a field or an organization and whether or not those values are exuded by the model that you're using.
Great. Now, it's all fine and well to talk about news organizations, but while they appropriate AI and integrate it into their practice, I think it's also important that we zoom out, because the more significant change we will see thanks to AI might actually happen on the digital infrastructures that we all use to consume, share, and produce information. So again, the question to our panel is, what changes do you see in this sort of wider ecosystem in which news exists, and the platforms on which news sort of gets shared and produced, where Gen AI increasingly will be used, and we sort of see that slowly happening. What do you see there? What is happening, and how might that affect news organizations as part of that ecosystem? Maybe starting with Chris.
Yeah, everything we're talking about is really lovely, and it's also the most fun part of my job is how we might use this in the newsroom, but ultimately it might be completely irrelevant, because actually all of the power does lie with the platforms, the device owners, the browser people as well, right? A lot of this is about not whether OpenAI can attract a certain number of people to be really regular users of ChatGPT, but is in fact, where does Google build this into their tooling? Because you're already there. And we're talking about workspaces, we're talking about search, we're talking about, the browser, a very useful place to execute prompts because you're probably looking at something you'd like to do something to. Here's a long read from The Guardian. I wish it was shorter. Press a button, does it in the browser, right? So I think the answer to this is, depends a lot on what all of those organizations do. And we won't necessarily have much control over that. The iPhone, something is going to happen there pretty soon, right? The next big iPhone festival will almost certainly be about how they're going to do this with on-device LLMs. So it's quite worrying. And I definitely don't have any response to say how we deal with that because it is not in our control.
I mean, I guess maybe the larger pattern here is disintermediation, right? So instead of having a direct relationship with your audience, there's going to be an AI layer in between the news producer and the audience, and potentially another organization will own that layer. And, if you think of this, sorry if this is triggering, but, you can think about news production as news gathering, news production, news distribution. And it's like, well, first the platforms came for distribution, right? News organizations used to own their distribution channels, and then platforms were like, no, we're going to eat that. If you're lucky, we'll send you some clicks. And now the AI companies are coming for production. So they're sort of like eating into the production layer of content, actual content creation. And as they kind of eat into that and start to disintermediate that, what does that mean for where news organizations get pushed in that production process? Do they get pushed into the news gathering phase of production? Maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I think there's a lot of potential in news gathering using these tools to accelerate document analysis, pattern finding, helping to uncover interesting connections or ideas that could turn into stories. And maybe if news organizations really unlock the power of these technologies, they can get really good at that and sell the value of that up the AI production chain, the value chain for AI. So selling that, the value of that gathering back up to OpenAI and Google and so on. But maybe also you don't want to be pushed into that corner. And so We need to find other ways to resist this disintermediation.
Yes.
Yeah, so another topic related to the digital infrastructures or the model providers that I feel we are talking a little bit too little about in our industry is the risks of model lock-in or provider lock-in. I'm going to have or speak on an unpopular opinion now, I think, but we've seen this movement over the past year where AI has become democratized, which is great. The tools are much more accessible than they have ever been before. The interfaces are easy to use. Anyone can become a prompt engineer. And generally, that's good. We're all getting to know the tooling. We're all getting to feel the power or the possible power of the technology. But I fear that news organizations are running a bit too quickly on that easy-to-access, no-code approach to AI and not investing in the serious, deep technical expertise that this shift requires. I think a lot about how technical oversight and technical accountability is essentially editorial oversight, editorial accountability. And if we don't have people within our own organizations who truly understand what goes on under the hood, we are putting what we say as our core value, our editorial mission, into a black box that we are fine with somebody else controlling. So that's something that I'm a bit concerned about. And I think it's quite easy to fix. We just need to allocate more money to that part of the budget, recruit more that type of talent. But it's not something that I'm seeing our industry doing right now.
Wonderful. Yep. We've got that.
I think one other crucial bit about that is about having cross-functional teams who genuinely want to learn from each other, technicians who want to understand editorial and vice versa, and the more we can cross-fertilize, the better. The other thing I was going to say is I feel a bit bleak about how I ended my last comment about the future, but I was talking to a venture capitalist guy the other week, and he said, broadly speaking, you guys are already dead. And
how is that a more cheerful comment, Chris?
I promise I'll get there. There's a trough, but then we'll work our way out to the sunlight. But he basically said, you guys are going to end up, if you're smart, you should move now, and you should end up you're not going to have a website. Forget about the website. You're just going to provide the data, the Lego of news to Apple or whoever it is, and you will send those to them, and they will assemble it into articles that are personally turned for Dave on his iPhone. And that's pretty bleak. But it also struck me that there's like a restaurant analogy here, I think, right? Nobody is going to restaurants and saying, please shut down your restaurant and now send all of your tomatoes and your mushrooms and your carrots to Dave, and he will cook them. And you will get the value of that, because you don't go to a restaurant just because they've got carrots there, right? You go to a restaurant because they cook it and the experience is good, and maybe you have an affinity with that restaurant. So I think there is, do you know what I mean? I think it's easy to take that kind of, this is the way it's going to go, guys, you are dead. Actually, I think there is a brighter future, and I think there is a possible future which opens up for people who really commit to thinking deeply about these things and high levels of quality.
I don't know. The restaurants don't have a great track record for being
Nick
going concerns. So.
All right, let's keep it cheerful, guys. I've just been told we've got about 10 to maybe 15 minutes left. So let's open up the floor and get questions from you people. So hands up. Who wants to ask something? And I see someone in the front row, so we will go with you. And then anyone else, please raise a hand and we will get to you.
Hi, Christoph Schweiger, freelance journalist from Malta. Chris, you mentioned tools like AI headline generators and summarizing live blogs. If Santa had to appear this year and ask you for the ultimate AI tool, a newsroom you would just use, but it would work to your desired parameters, what would that tool look like and be?
Thank you. Great question. We should all have a go at that. But fundamentally, it's not whether it's a headline generator or a summarizer. I can control that bit. All I want it to do is be accurate. then leave us to play with whatever the output is. I don't really care. There are so many options if you have the accuracy that it suddenly becomes exciting, right?
Anyone else? No? Any more questions? Amazing.
Hi, I'm Isao from Japan, and I'd like to ask you, please imagine in the near future, 90% of the people get news from AI-generated text or video. Should we write for AI, especially paraphrase for AI, or especially formatted for AI? Or should AP stylebook be revised for in order that articles should be processed correctly by AI? Or are we still journalists or just data providers?
I mean, my sense is that we won't need to rewrite stuff just for AI because the AI will be able to rewrite it for itself. So I'm not sure. I mean, no one really knows what's going to happen in the near future, but I don't know that I necessarily see that scenario as happening because I think that these models are powerful enough already to extract the information that they need from written language in a way that they can then manipulate further and operate on.
I could just continue on that. I connect, or I think a lot about hyper-personalization in the content of context of generative AI. And when you say AI distributed to Dave or to whoever it's coming to, it's a hyper-personalized version of a piece of content or a piece of information. And while hyper-personalization or content versioning is really exciting in many ways, it allows us to give the best possible experience or the most relevant information for the individual user. There's also quite significant risks with the idea of everybody having their own version of the world, or us losing this shared narrative, the story of our time. And I think that's a role that the news media can play, not the same way that we have in the past, but in a new way, finding that kind of the core building blocks of the shared narrative. And then I'm fine with us distributing atoms for AI to version in lots of different ways. But I think us providing that shared narrative, or the basis for the shared narrative, is going to be very important.
Do we have any more questions, or do we stun you all into silence? There's one over there. Amazing.
Hi, I'm Lucy. I write for TechEU. Nick, I think your findings are so interesting that the efficiencies that have been produced by Gen AI just aren't what's been promised, especially as the fact is that more than 10,000 journalists have been laid off within the UK and the US. I'm interested in, have you observed like a direct over-reliance on generative AI within the current news that we're seeing as a result of that reduction in the workforce?
Yeah, I'm also curious to hear from the other panelists on this, but I have not seen a direct connection. I mean, there are a lot of forces at play in the industry, and I don't know that we can necessarily draw a straight line between what's happening with technology right now and the most recent wave of layoffs. Typically, I think if you ask an economist, they'll say, well, new technologies, they kind of take a while to like work their way through the industry and demonstrate efficiencies and then lead to redundancies like you might observe in a particular industry like the news industry. So there are anecdotes here and there, right? But I don't think that the latest wave of layoffs can be attributed to AI per se.
Yeah, I mean, I'll briefly chime in this one from the evidence point of view. Like what I've seen in my research is dovetails with what Nick has said. It's basically it's way too early in some ways, even with other forms of AI to sort of say that. In many ways, you can also argue that it's quite a convenient fig leaf that you can use. You can say, oh, this is all, we have now AI and we can sort of use that and therefore we don't need you people. Whereas in fact, in some cases, that just covered for layoffs that were on the books already and were sort of being planned, and then AI and Gen AI came along and it was kind of convenient to say, oh, it's actually the technology. But I think much to Nick's point, so far, it's kind of a really difficult argument to make that it's all to AI and sort of the job losses we're seeing now are thanks to it, but that might be a different story in 5 or 10 years.
And even in terms of, I mean, I wrote a book, came out in 2019, so it's already getting old, but in the book, the argument is kind of like, well, yeah, AI is great, it kind of unlocks new capabilities, but in that book, I also did not argue that AI was leading to job loss, because in example after example, what I saw was that whenever news organizations were rolling out AI, it was actually creating more work for human beings. So you need to hire more people. And we also saw this recently in the AP survey. I mean, there's tons of new roles being created to kind of just come to terms with how generative AI can be used, how to use it effectively, how to think about it strategically for your newsroom, and so on. And so maybe some of those roles are like reformatting, pre-existing roles, but I think there are generally also some new positions being created to grapple with this.
I also agree with AI being an easy scapegoat or kind of illustrative force almost to blame job loss on. But I also think this discourse around AI job loss is quite illustrative of our industry's approach to the tools in general. I feel like we are taking a very defense-oriented approach, treating AI as a threat to manage or save ourselves from, and kind of unignorable force that we have to protect our industry from, rather than as an opportunity that we can grasp and benefit from. So I think if we reallocated some of the time we spent discussing job loss to discussing explorative innovation, we might be better positioned to actually reaping those opportunities.
I think we might have time for one more question. So if anyone wants to go, then that's your chance. If not, I will. Okay. Yep, last question, make it short.
Hi, thanks for the discussion. Could we elaborate a little bit on the platform side? I mean, we were playing around with Copilot today, asking it to summarize what's going on in Iran, and how did it pick which media it would credit, right? It would draw from. Do we know? Do we need to know? Shouldn't they disclose how the algorithm works?
Who wants to take it?
No, we don't know. Do they have to disclose it? No, they don't have to disclose it. It's not just an algorithm, right? They may not even be able to explain it, even if they could lay it out in front of us. I mean, the questions are the same that we need to pose to ourselves, is what is a responsible deployment of this technology? And one of the, I think, genuinely frightening things in the background of this whole technology is currently it is being very effectively used as a weapon by one large corporation against one other very big specific corporation. And the integration of the technology into various places is being fueled by that and the response to that aggressive position. So I think one thing I would love to see in the next year is, frankly, from everybody, better journalism about this too, right? We are also journalists. We need to understand it and explain it to the world, and we need to ask more questions of these organizations and these individuals, because I think Charlie kind of made this point on another panel. This isn't just, the technology is amazing. It is about how we deploy the technology. It is about decisions humans are making about where it is appropriate and where it can work. So there are people to be held to account.
Wonderful. And on that note, we will close. Thank you so much for attending. Thanks to all the people who supported this work. Thanks to the Journalism Festival. Thanks to you, and have a great evening.
Vivi l'Umbria, con la politica di coesione dell'Unione Europea.